My mom lied about having lung disease so I would take care of her until I caught her in the act. The phone rang at 12:47 a.m. and I knew before I answered that my life was about to change. Honey, I need to tell you something. My mother's voice cracked through the speaker. Thick with tears I could practically feel through the phone. I went to the doctor today and it's not good. I sat up in bed, my husband stirring beside me. Mom, what are you talking about? What's wrong? They found something in my lungs. She broke into sobs that made my chest tighten. The doctor says I can't live alone anymore. I'm going to need help with everything. My hands started shaking. What do you mean, something in your lungs? What kind of something? I can't say it out loud yet, but I'm scared, sweetheart. I'm so scared and I don't know what to do. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Would it be possible for me to stay with you and Ryan for a while, just until we figure out what comes next? The question hung in the air like smoke. Ryan rolled over, squinting at me in the dim light from my phone screen. I could see the concern already creeping across his face. Of course, Mom, of course you can stay here. We'll figure this out together. Thank you, baby. Thank you so much. I don't know what I'd do without you. After I hung up, Ryan and I lay in the dark, processing what had just happened. How bad do you think it is? He asked quietly. I don't know. She wouldn't even say the word. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. But if she needs help with daily things, it must be pretty serious. We'll make it work, he said, reaching for my hand. Whatever she needs. I squeezed his fingers, grateful for his immediate support, but already feeling the weight of what was coming. My mother had always been independent to a fault. For her to ask for help meant she was truly desperate. 3 days later, she arrived with 2 suitcases and a face that looked like she'd aged 10 years since I'd last seen her. Her shoulders were hunched and she moved carefully, as if every step required concentration. The guest room is all ready for you, I said, leading her down the hallway. We'd spent the weekend rearranging furniture, buying a humidifier, and making sure everything was within easy reach. You two are angels, she said, settling onto the edge of the bed with a heavy sigh. I hate being such a burden. You're not a burden, Mom. You're family. But even as I said it, I felt a knot forming in my stomach. The guest room had been Ryan's home office. His work papers were now stacked in our bedroom, his computer crammed into a corner of the living room. We'd already started making sacrifices, and she'd only been here for an hour. That first week was a crash course in caregiving. Mom barely left her room except for meals, and when she did venture out, she moved like someone walking through water. She'd pause at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing and breathing hard. Simple tasks like opening jars or carrying a plate seemed to exhaust her. I'm sorry, she'd say after asking me to bring her a glass of water. I hate being this helpless. The guilt in her voice made my heart ache, so I threw myself into taking care of her. I researched nutrition for people with lung issues, bought organic everything, and started meal prepping so she'd always have something easy to eat. Ryan and I took turns checking on her throughout the day, like parents with a newborn. But the stress was already showing. Ryan came home from work one evening to find me crying in the kitchen. What's wrong? He asked, immediately wrapping his arms around me. I can't find the right balance, I said into his chest. I want to be there for her, but I feel like I'm failing at everything else. I forgot about our dinner plans with the Andersons. I haven't done laundry in a week, and I can barely focus at work because I'm worried about her being alone here. Hey, we're figuring this out as we go. Cut yourself some slack. But what if she gets worse? What if this is just the beginning? Ryan didn't have an answer for that, and neither did I. We held each other in the kitchen while my mother's cough echoed softly from down the hall. By the second week, the cracks in our routine were becoming chasms. I'd started working from home more often, which meant Ryan had to pick up the slack with errands and household maintenance. Our conversations had become tactical briefings about who was doing what and when. Can you grab her prescription on your way home? I'd ask. Sure, but I might be late. I'm covering the Peterson account since you missed the client meeting. I had to take her to the follow-up appointment. I told you that. I know, I'm not complaining, I'm just saying. But we both were complaining, in small ways that felt petty, but added up to something bigger. The easy rhythm we'd built over 5 years of marriage was being disrupted by the constant awareness that someone else was depending on us. Mom seemed to sense the tension, which only made her more apologetic and somehow more fragile. She'd shuffle to the kitchen in her robe, moving like every joint hurt, and insist she could make her own breakfast. Don't be silly, I'd say, already reaching for the eggs. Sit down and rest. I feel terrible making you do everything. You're not making me do anything. I want to help. And I did want to help, but I also wanted to sleep through the night without listening for her cough. I wanted to have a conversation with my husband that didn't revolve around medication schedules and doctor appointments. I wanted to feel like a wife again, not just a caregiver. The worst part was the uncertainty. Mom still hadn't told us exactly what the doctors had found, just that it was serious and that treatment would take time. Every cough made me wonder if things were getting worse. Every time she stayed in bed later than usual, I'd panic and check on her. How are you feeling today? Became my daily greeting, and her answer was always some variation of tired or not great. She'd smile weakly and pat my hand, and I'd feel the familiar surge of love mixed with fear that had become my new normal. 3 weeks in, Ryan and I finally had our first real fight about the situation. It started over something stupid. He'd forgotten to buy the special crackers she liked, but escalated into everything we'd been holding back. I feel like I'm living with a stranger, he said, his voice tight with frustration. We never talk anymore unless it's about your mom. She's sick, Ryan. What do you want me to do? Ignore her? I'm not saying ignore her. I'm saying we need to figure out how to have a life too. I stared at him, feeling like he was asking me to choose between my mother and my marriage. The unfairness of it made me furious, but underneath the anger was the terrible suspicion that he might be right. To understand how we got to that breaking point, I need to back up 6 months to when my father packed his bags and walked out of my parents' 30-year marriage. Mom called me that day too, but her voice was different then. Hollow, shocked, like she couldn't quite believe what had happened. He said he needs space to find himself, she told me, and I could practically hear her rolling her eyes through the phone. At 58 years old, he wants to find himself. I drove over immediately and found her sitting at the kitchen table, still in her work clothes, staring at the note Dad had left. It was 2 sentences long, 2 sentences to end 3 decades. I don't understand, she kept saying. We had plans. plans. We were going to travel when I retired. We were going to see the grandkids more. There weren't any grandkids yet, but that was part of their plan too. Ryan and I had been trying for over a year, and my parents were already talking about converting the basement into a playroom. Maybe he'll come back, I said, because I didn't know what else to offer. Maybe he just needs some time to work through whatever this is. But even as I said it, I knew Dad wasn't coming back. I'd seen the way he'd been pulling away over the past year, staying late at work, taking weekend trips with his college buddies, talking about all the things he'd never gotten to do. The midlife crisis had been building for months, but none of us had wanted to acknowledge it. Mom threw herself into staying busy those first few weeks. She reorganized every closet in the house, started a vegetable garden, and signed up for 3 different exercise classes. When I called to check on her, she always had a project to tell me about. I'm refinishing the guest bathroom, she'd say, and I'm thinking about taking up pottery. There's a class at the community center, but I could hear the forced cheer in her voice, and when I stopped by unannounced, I'd sometimes catch her just sitting in the living room, staring at nothing. The real change came gradually. She started calling more often, just to chat, but the conversations always seemed to circle back to how quiet the house was, or how she'd made dinner for 2 out of habit. She'd ask about Ryan and me constantly, wanting to know what we were doing for the weekend, what we'd had for dinner, whether we'd watched anything good on TV. You don't have to entertain me, I told her after one particularly long call where she'd asked me to describe our entire grocery shopping trip. It's okay to just say you're lonely. I'm not lonely, she insisted. I'm just interested in your life. But she was lonely, and it was getting worse. She started showing up at our house without calling first, always with some excuse. She'd bring us dinner because she'd made too much, or she'd need to borrow our ladder to change a light bulb, or she'd want to drop off mail that had been delivered to her house by mistake. Ryan was patient about it at first. He'd chat with her about her job at the insurance office, help her carry things to her car, and make sure she felt welcome. But I could see him getting tired of the constant interruptions to our time together. She's hurting, I told him after one evening when she'd stayed until almost 10 o'clock, talking in circles about whether she should sell the house. She's never lived alone before. She went straight from her parents' house to living with Dad. I get that, he said, but she needs to find her own way through this. You can't be her emotional support system for the rest of her life. She's my mother, Ryan. What am I supposed to do? Abandon her? I'm not saying abandon her. I'm saying set some boundaries. But boundaries felt impossible when she looked so lost every time I saw her. Mom had always been the strong one in our family, the one who held everything together when Dad was working long hours or when money was tight. Seeing her unmoored was like watching someone try to navigate without a compass. She started talking about downsizing, maybe moving to a smaller place closer to us, just so we could see each other more often, she'd say. And I'd feel that familiar tug between wanting to help and wanting to protect the life Ryan and I were building. We'd been married for 5 years and we were finally hitting our stride. Ryan had gotten a promotion that meant we could start thinking seriously about buying a house. I was up for a management position at work. We talked about starting a family soon, maybe taking a big trip to Europe before kids made travel more complicated. All of those conversations started feeling less certain when Mom was around. Not because she said anything directly, but because her sadness seemed to fill up whatever space she occupied. Our easy weekend mornings became careful negotiations around whether we should invite her over or risk hurting her feelings by keeping our plans to ourselves. I feel guilty all the time, I confessed to Ryan one night. When I'm with her, I feel bad that she's so alone. When I'm not with her, I feel bad that I'm not doing more to help. You can't fix her loneliness, he said gently. That's something she has to work on herself. But what if she can't? What if she just gets more and more dependent on us until we can't have our own life anymore? It was a fear I didn't want to voice, but it was growing stronger every time she called. The woman who had raised me to be independent was becoming increasingly unable to handle independence herself. Then came the night she called crying about being sick, and suddenly all those fears about her emotional dependence seemed trivial compared to the possibility that she might actually need us to survive. Of course we'll take care of her, Ryan said after I explained what the doctor had supposedly told her. Family takes care of family. I loved him for saying it without hesitation, but I also wondered if he understood what we were signing up for. Taking care of someone with a serious illness wasn't just about providing a place to stay. It was about reorganizing your entire life around someone else's needs. Still, when she arrived with her suitcases and that fragile, frightened look on her face, I felt like maybe this was how I could finally help her. Maybe being needed would give her purpose again, and taking care of her would give me a way to pay back everything she'd done for me growing up. I had no idea that within weeks, I'd be questioning everything I thought I knew about both of us. The first sign that this was going to be harder than I'd imagined came on Mom's 4th day with us. I was getting ready for work when I heard a crash from the kitchen, followed by a weak call for help. I rushed downstairs to find her sitting on the floor next to the overturned coffee pot, looking dazed and embarrassed. I got dizzy, she said, letting me help her to a chair. I was just trying to make coffee and everything went sideways. Mom, you should have called for help. What if you'd gotten burned? I didn't want to bother you. You're already doing so much. I cleaned up the mess and made her breakfast while she sat at the table, looking small and defeated. When I left for work, I found myself checking my phone constantly, worried about what might happen while she was alone. That became the pattern. Every day brought some new reminder of how fragile she'd become. She'd call me at work because she couldn't open a jar, or because she'd forgotten to take her medication and wasn't sure if she should take it late. She'd nap for hours in the afternoon, emerging looking confused and disoriented. I used to be able to do everything, she told me one evening, tears in her eyes. Now I can barely make it through the day without help. The guilt was crushing. Here was the woman who had taken care of me my entire childhood, who had juggled work and household management and never seemed to struggle with any of it. Now she needed help with the most basic tasks, and I was complaining about the inconvenience. But it was more than inconvenient. It was consuming our lives. Ryan started working longer hours, partly because someone had to pick up the slack from my increased absences, but also because home had stopped feeling like a refuge. When he did come home, he'd find Mom planted in the living room, watching TV at a volume that made conversation impossible, or me stressed and exhausted from a day of managing her needs alongside my job. How was your day? He'd ask, and I'd launch into a rundown of Mom's symptoms, her mood, her medication schedule, her doctor's appointment next week. We'd been together 5 years, but suddenly we sounded like business partners giving status updates. The money started becoming an issue too. Mom's insurance covered some of her medical expenses, but there were so many things it didn't cover. special pillows for her breathing, organic groceries because processed food made her feel worse, a humidifier for her room, supplements the doctor recommended. We're spending more on her care than we used to spend on groceries for both of us, Ryan pointed out after a particularly expensive trip to the pharmacy. She's sick, Ryan. What do you want me to do? Let her suffer because it's expensive? I'm not saying let her suffer. I'm saying maybe we need to look into other options. There are programs for people in her situation. You want to put my mother in a program? I want us to explore all the options instead of just assuming we have to handle everything ourselves. But exploring other options felt like giving up on her, and I couldn't do that. Not when she looked at me with such gratitude every time I brought her a cup of tea or helped her up the stairs. The breaking point came 3 weeks after she'd moved in. Ryan and I had planned a weekend trip to celebrate our wedding anniversary. Just one night at a bed and breakfast an hour away. We'd booked it months earlier, and I'd been looking forward to it as a chance to reconnect after the stress of the past few weeks. But Friday afternoon, Mom started having what she called breathing episodes. She'd sit in her chair, gasping and clutching her chest, looking terrified. I can't catch my breath, she'd say. It feels like my lungs aren't working right. I called her doctor, who said it could be anxiety related to her condition and suggested some breathing exercises. But every time we tried to leave her alone for more than an hour, the episodes would start again. Maybe we should just cancel the trip, I told Ryan Friday evening after Mom had spent 20 minutes struggling to breathe normally. We've been planning this for months. I know, but look at her. What if something happens while we're gone? Ryan looked at Mom, who was now breathing normally but still looked shaken. What if we asked your sister to come stay with her? Aunt Rachel lives 3 hours away. She can't just drop everything. Then what about hiring someone? A nurse or a companion? A stranger? Ryan, she's terrified enough already. You want me to leave her with someone she doesn't know? We canceled the trip. I called the bed and breakfast and lost the deposit, then spent Saturday night listening to Mom cough in the next room while Ryan slept with a pillow over his head. Sunday morning, he was quiet while making coffee. Too quiet. What's wrong? I asked. I'm tired, he said simply. I'm tired of our life being completely controlled by your mother's health problems. She didn't choose to get sick. I know that, but we did choose how to handle it, and I'm starting to think we chose wrong. What's that supposed to mean? It means maybe there are better ways to help her than turning our house into a hospital and our marriage into a caregiving partnership. I stared at him, feeling like he'd slapped me. She's been here 3 weeks, Ryan. 3 weeks. 3 weeks where we haven't had a single conversation that wasn't about her symptoms or her needs or her doctor appointments. 3 weeks where you've checked on her more often than you've kissed me. So this is about you feeling neglected? This is about us losing ourselves in someone else's crisis. But it wasn't someone else's crisis. It was my mother's crisis, which made it my crisis too. The fact that Ryan couldn't understand that difference made me question everything I thought I knew about our partnership. That night, Mom had another breathing episode. I sat with her until nearly midnight, timing her breaths and trying to keep her calm. When I finally got to bed, Ryan was already asleep, turned away from me with his back rigid. Work became my escape, which was ironic since I was constantly distracted there by worry about Mom. But at least at the office, I could focus on problems that had solutions. I could finish tasks and feel accomplished instead of just feeling like I was barely keeping up with an endless stream of needs. My coworkers started noticing the change. During a team meeting, my boss asked if everything was okay at home. My mother's been staying with us, I said. She's dealing with some health issues. That's rough. Are you getting the support you need? I wanted to laugh. Support? I was the support. Ryan and I were fighting more than we ever had. I was exhausted all the time, and I felt guilty every second I wasn't actively helping Mom feel better. We're managing, I said, because what else could I say? But we weren't managing, we were drowning. The intimacy between Ryan and me disappeared completely. Not just physical intimacy, though that was gone too, but the emotional closeness that had always been the foundation of our relationship. We moved around each other like polite roommates, coordinating schedules and dividing up responsibilities, but never just talking. When we did try to have a conversation that wasn't about logistics, Mom would inevitably interrupt. She'd call from her room because she needed water, or she'd shuffle into the living room looking lost and asking what we were talking about. I feel like I'm living in a fishbowl, Ryan told me one evening after Mom had joined us on the couch and proceeded to narrate the entire TV show we were trying to watch. There's no privacy, no space for us to just be together. She's lonely and she's scared. Can you try to be a little more understanding? I've been understanding for weeks, but understanding doesn't mean I have to be happy about watching our marriage fall apart. Our marriage isn't falling apart, isn't it? When's the last time we had sex? When's the last time we went anywhere together? When's the last time you asked me how my day was without immediately launching into a medical update about your mother? I couldn't answer any of those questions, which made his point more effectively than any argument could have. The money situation got worse too. Mom's medical expenses were adding up faster than I'd expected, and she seemed to need something new every week. Special tea that was supposed to help with inflammation, a different kind of pillow that might help her breathing, appointments with specialists that required taking time off work. We're going to have to dip into our savings, I told Ryan after paying for another round of tests that insurance had only partially covered. The savings for the house? We'd been saving for a down payment for 3 years. It was finally getting close to enough for something decent in our area. It's temporary, I said. Once we figure out her treatment plan, things will stabilize. And if they don't, what if this is just the beginning? What if she keeps getting worse? I didn't want to think about that possibility, but it was getting harder to ignore. Every week brought new symptoms or new limitations. The woman who had raised me to be independent was becoming more dependent by the day, and I was the only person she had to depend on. The worst part was how guilty she seemed to feel about it all. She'd apologize constantly for needing help, for being a burden, for changing our lives. The apologies made it impossible to be frustrated with her without feeling like a terrible person. I know this is hard on you and Ryan, she said one evening after a particularly difficult day. I see how tired you both are. We're fine, Mom. This is what family does. I just hate that my problems are becoming your problems. Your problems are my problems. That's how this works. But even as I said it, I wondered if that was really true. Was it healthy for one person's crisis to completely consume multiple other people's lives? Was there a point where helping someone meant enabling them to avoid finding their own solutions? I pushed those thoughts away because they felt selfish and cruel. Mom was sick and scared and needed us. The rest could wait until she was better. The problem was, she wasn't getting better. If anything, she seemed to be getting more fragile and more dependent every day. And Ryan and I were getting further apart as the weight of caring for her pushed us toward our breaking point. The first crack in Mom's story came on a Tuesday afternoon when I left work early with a migraine. I'd been getting them more frequently since she'd moved in, probably from stress and lack of sleep. My boss took one look at me and sent me home. I pulled into our driveway expecting to find Mom napping or watching TV in the living room, but the house was quiet. Too quiet. I called her name as I walked through the front door but got no response. Panic shot through me. What if she'd had one of her breathing episodes and couldn't call for help? What if she'd fallen? I rushed upstairs to check her room, but it was empty. The bed was made, her slippers were gone, and her purse wasn't on the dresser where she usually kept it. That's when I heard voices from the backyard. I looked out the kitchen window and saw Mom standing by our back fence, talking animatedly with our neighbor Mrs. Patterson. But it wasn't just the fact that she was outside that stopped me cold. It was how she was standing. Straight, confident. No hunched shoulders, no careful movements, no hand pressed to her chest like she was struggling to breathe. She was gesturing with both hands while she talked, laughing at something Mrs. Patterson had said. I watched for maybe 2 minutes before she noticed me in the window. The change was immediate. Her shoulders sagged, her hand went to her chest, and she started walking back toward the house with the slow, careful steps I'd gotten used to seeing. "Hi, sweetheart," she said when she came through the back door, slightly out of breath. "I didn't expect you home so early. I was just getting some fresh air." "You were talking to Mrs. Patterson." "Yes, she's such a nice woman. She was asking how I'm feeling, but something about the way she said it felt off. Mom had always been a terrible liar, and there was a carefulness to her words that hadn't been there before." "How are you feeling?" I asked, studying her face. "Oh, you know, some days are better than others. Today's been pretty good, actually." A pretty good day for her usually meant she could make it downstairs without getting winded, but I just watched her stand outside for several minutes without any sign of difficulty. "I'm glad you're having a good day," I said, but my mind was racing. That night, I found myself paying closer attention to her movements around the house. When she thought I wasn't looking, she seemed to move more easily, but the moment she realized I was watching, the frailty would return. It was subtle enough that I questioned whether I was imagining it. Stress could make you paranoid, and I'd been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe I was looking for problems that weren't there. But then Thursday happened. I'd gone to the grocery store after work to pick up the special items Mom needed for her restricted diet. Organic this, gluten-free that, the expensive supplements her doctor had supposedly recommended. I was standing in the checkout line, feeling guilty about how much money I was about to spend, when I saw her. She was 3 checkout lanes over, pushing a cart full of regular groceries. Not the carefully selected items we'd been buying for her supposed health condition, but normal food. Processed snacks, regular bread, things she'd told us made her feel worse. I ducked behind a display so she wouldn't see me and watched as she paid with cash. She seemed completely at ease, chatting with the cashier, lifting bags without any difficulty. When I got home 20 minutes later, she was back in her chair in the living room looking tired and frail. "How was your day?" I asked, setting down the bags of expensive organic groceries. "Quiet. I mostly just rested. This weather makes me feel so drained." She was lying. There was no question about it now. I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. Small things that I'd attributed to her illness began to look different under closer scrutiny, like how her breathing episodes always seemed to happen when Ryan and I were trying to have time alone together, or how her worst days coincided perfectly with times when we'd made plans that didn't include her. One evening, I pretended to go to bed early but actually sat at the top of the stairs, listening. I heard her moving around the living room normally, no signs of the weakness that made climbing stairs so difficult for her during the day. I heard her in the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets without the careful, labored movements she displayed when we were around. The next morning, I mentioned that I'd heard her moving around late at night. "Oh, that wasn't me," she said quickly. "Must have been the neighbor's cat. Sometimes it gets on our roof." But we lived in a townhouse. There was no way she could have mistaken sounds from inside our house for a cat on a roof that didn't exist. I started testing her in small ways. I'd ask her to help with simple tasks, and she'd always decline, claiming fatigue or breathing problems. But when she thought I wasn't paying attention, I'd catch glimpses of her doing things that should have been difficult if she was really as sick as she claimed. The breaking point came the following Tuesday. I'd left work early again, this time because of a last-minute client cancellation. I decided to stop by the pharmacy to pick up Mom's medications before heading home. "Oh, your mother was just here?" the pharmacist told me when I gave her Mom's name. "About an hour ago." "She was here, are you sure?" "Absolutely." She picked up her prescription and chatted with me for a few minutes. Lovely woman. She was telling me about the garden she's planning to plant in your backyard. A garden. Mom had told us she could barely make it up and down the stairs, but she was planning to plant a garden. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, trying to process what I'd learned. Then I saw her. She was carrying 2 large shopping bags from her car to our front door. Not dragging them, not struggling with them, but carrying them like they weighed nothing. She was moving with the confidence and energy of someone half her age. When she saw my car, she quickly set the bags down and pressed a hand to her chest, immediately adopting the posture of someone who was unwell. But I'd already seen enough. I sat in my car and watched her slowly, carefully pick up the bags again, moving like every step was an effort. The performance was so obvious now that I couldn't believe I'd missed it before. I waited until she was inside before I got out of my car. When I walked through the front door, she was sitting in her usual chair, looking tired and pale. "Hi, honey," she said, slightly breathless. "I had to go out for a few things. It really took it out of me." "What did you need to get?" "Oh, just some personal items, nothing important." But the bags I'd seen her carrying were from the grocery store, not a pharmacy or convenience store. And they'd been heavy enough that a truly frail person would have struggled with them. I excused myself and went upstairs to think. Every interaction from the past few weeks was replaying in my mind, but now with a different interpretation. The convenient timing of her breathing episodes, the way her symptoms seemed to worsen whenever Ryan and I tried to have any time together, the fact that she never seemed to improve, despite weeks of rest and care. That evening, I called her doctor's office. I told them I was her daughter and asked about her test results, claiming I'd been in the waiting room during her last appointment but hadn't heard everything clearly. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any record of recent appointments for your mother," the receptionist told me. "Her last visit was for a routine physical 6 months ago. Everything was normal." "Are you sure?" "She's been having serious breathing problems, lung issues. I'm looking at her file now. No respiratory issues noted, no recent tests ordered. She's actually one of our healthiest patients in her age group." I hung up feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me. 6 months ago was before Dad had left. Mom had been fine then, according to her doctor. No mysterious illness, no breathing problems, nothing that would explain the frail, dependent woman who'd been living in our guest room. I spent the rest of the evening pretending everything was normal while my mind raced. Every cough, every labored movement, every exhausted sigh I'd witnessed over the past month suddenly looked like a performance. But why? Why would she fake being sick? Why would she manipulate us into upending our lives to take care of her? Then I remembered something she'd said shortly after Dad left. I don't know how to be alone. I've never lived by myself in my entire life. The loneliness, it was about the loneliness. She hadn't been able to figure out how to rebuild her life after Dad left, so she'd created a crisis that would force me to let her into mine. The illness was her ticket into our house, our marriage, our daily routine. I felt sick thinking about it. All the money we'd spent, all the fights Ryan and I had had, all the worry and stress and rearranging of our lives, it had all been based on a lie. But I needed to be absolutely certain before I confronted her. I needed proof that couldn't be explained away or justified. The opportunity came 2 days later. I told Mom I had a full day of meetings and wouldn't be home until evening. But instead of going to work, I parked down the street where I could see our house and waited. Within an hour, I watched her leave the house moving normally, get into her car, and drive away. I followed her at a distance and watched her go to the grocery store, the bank, and then to a coffee shop where she met 2 friends for what looked like a very animated conversation. She was laughing, gesturing, completely at ease. There was no sign of the breathing problems that had kept her homebound for weeks. No sign of the weakness that made simple tasks impossible. I followed her home and watched her carry multiple bags from her car to the house without any difficulty. Then I waited another hour before coming home from work. When I walked through the door, she was back in her chair, looking tired and fragile. "How was your day?" I asked. "Exhausting," she said with a weak smile. "I tried to do a little cleaning, but it really wore me out. I've been resting ever since." That's when I knew for certain that everything, the illness, the frailty, the dependence, had been an elaborate lie designed to manipulate me into giving her what she wanted. A place in my life where she couldn't be abandoned or left alone. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating that I could barely process it. But anger was starting to build underneath the shock, and I knew it was time for the truth to come out. I spent the entire night staring at the ceiling, rage and disbelief churning in my stomach. Every few minutes, I'd hear Mom's fake cough echo from down the hall, and it took everything in me not to march into her room and scream at her right then. But I needed Ryan to know the truth too. He deserved to understand what we'd been put through, and I needed his support for what was about to happen. The next morning, I waited until Mom went to take her usual restorative nap before pulling Ryan aside. "We need to talk," I said, leading him out to the backyard where she couldn't overhear us. "About my mother." "What about her?" "She's not sick, Ryan. She's been lying to us this entire time." He stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "What are you talking about?" I told him everything. The pharmacy visit, the doctor's office, watching her carry heavy bags without difficulty. With each detail, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to something that looked like the same anger I'd been carrying. "Are you absolutely sure?" he asked when I finished. "I followed her yesterday. I watched her spend 3 hours running errands, laughing with friends, moving around like there's nothing wrong with her. Then she came home and immediately went back to being helpless." Ryan sat down heavily on our back step. "So all of this, the canceled anniversary trip, the fights, the money we've spent, it was all for nothing? Worse than nothing. It was all based on a lie designed to manipulate us. But why? Why would she do something like this? Because she's lonely. Because she can't handle being alone after Dad left. And this was her way of forcing herself into our lives." Ryan was quiet for a long moment, processing. When he looked up at me, his face was hard in a way I'd rarely seen. "What do you want to do?" "I want to confront her. Tonight. I want her to admit what she's done. And then she needs to leave. I can't have someone in my house who's willing to lie to me like this." Ryan nodded. "I'll be there with you." We agreed to wait until after dinner, when Mom would be settled in the living room for her evening routine. I spent the day in a strange state of calm fury, watching her continue the performance that I now saw clearly for what it was. She asked me to help her open a jar of pickles, claiming her hands were too weak. She complained about feeling dizzy when she stood up too quickly. She made small pained sounds when she thought I was listening. Every fake symptom made me angrier. At 7 o'clock, Ryan and I sat down across from her in the living room. She was in her usual chair, wrapped in the blanket we'd bought specifically for her. Chills. "Mom, we need to talk to you about something," I said. She looked up from her TV show with a concerned expression. "Of course, honey. What's wrong?" "I went to the pharmacy yesterday to pick up your medications." "Oh, you didn't need to do that. I could have. The pharmacist told me you'd already been there. About an hour before I arrived." A flicker of something crossed her face, but she recovered quickly. "Yes, I managed to get there myself. I was feeling a little better yesterday. Better enough to carry heavy shopping bags?" "I don't know what you mean. I saw you, Mom. I came home early and watched you carry multiple heavy bags from your car to the house. No difficulty, no breathing problems, no weakness." The color drained from her face, but she shook her head. "You must have been mistaken. I called your doctor's office." That stopped her cold. "They have no record of any recent appointments. No tests, no lung problems, no health issues at all. According to them, you're one of their healthiest patients." Mom opened and closed her mouth like she was trying to find words, but nothing came out. 6 weeks, I continued, my voice getting louder despite my efforts to stay calm. 6 weeks you've been living here, letting us take care of you, letting us fight about how to handle your illness. 6 weeks of lying to our faces every single day. Sweetheart, I can explain. Explain what? Explain how you've been faking breathing problems? Explain how you've been pretending to be too weak to take care of yourself? Explain how you manipulated us into completely rearranging our lives based on a lie? Ryan leaned forward. "We canceled our anniversary trip because we were worried about leaving you alone. We've spent thousands of dollars on medical supplies and special food," I added. "We've barely spoken to each other about anything except your condition for over a month. I know you're upset," Mom started. "Upset?" I stood up, unable to sit still anymore. "Mom, I have been worried sick about you. I've been losing sleep, missing work, fighting with my husband, all because I thought you were dying." "I never said I was dying. You said you had something in your lungs that the doctor found. You said you couldn't live alone anymore. You called me crying and terrified, and I believed you because you're my mother and I trusted you." The words hung in the air between us. Mom looked small and cornered, but there was was no point in pretending anymore. Why? Ryan asked quietly. Why would you do this to us? For a long moment, Mom just stared at her hands. When she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but they looked different now. Real, instead of performed. I was so lonely, she whispered. After your father left, I didn't know how to live by myself. I've never lived alone. Not once in my entire life. So you decided to lie to us? I didn't plan it. Her voice was getting stronger, more defensive. At first, I was just feeling anxious and having trouble breathing because of the stress. But when I called you that night, you were so caring, so ready to help. And I thought, maybe if I needed you, you'd want me around more. You thought wrong, I said flatly. I know it was wrong. I know that now. But I was desperate. I was sitting in that house every night, eating dinner alone, going to bed alone, waking up alone. I felt like I was disappearing. So you made yourself disappear into our lives instead. I just wanted to feel needed again. I wanted to matter to someone. Ryan stood up beside me. You could have just told us you were struggling. We would have helped you figure out how to build a new life after the divorce. But you were both so busy with your own lives. I didn't want to be a burden. So instead you became a fake burden? The irony was so bitter I could taste it. Mom, you manipulated us into letting you be a burden. That's so much worse than just asking for help. I was going to tell you, she said desperately. Once I figured out how to live on my own, I was going to get better and move out and you'd never have to know. That's not how lies work, Mom. They don't just magically resolve themselves. And what about us? Ryan asked. What about the damage you've done to our marriage? Did you think about that when you were performing your breathing episodes every time we tried to have a private conversation? Mom looked genuinely surprised. I wasn't trying to hurt your marriage, but you did hurt it. We've been fighting constantly about time and money and priorities. We've been living like strangers because all of our attention has been focused on taking care of you. I'm sorry, she said, and the words sounded hollow. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. Yes, you did, I said, and my voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. You meant for exactly this to happen. You wanted us to rearrange our lives around you. You wanted to be the center of our attention. You just didn't want to deal with the consequences of asking for it honestly. Ryan reached for my hand. The question now is what happens next. Mom looked back and forth between us, and I could see her trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. I'll get better, she said quickly. Starting tomorrow, I'll start feeling better. I'll get more independent and things can go back to normal. No, I said. Things can't go back to normal. You can't undo this by pretending to recover from an illness you never had. Then what do you want me to do? I want you to pack your things and go home. Tonight. But I can't live alone. I told you. You've been living alone just fine. You've been driving yourself around town, shopping, meeting friends for coffee. You've been perfectly capable of taking care of yourself this entire time. Please don't make me leave. I'll do anything. I'll pay you back for the money you've spent. It's not about the money, Mom. It's about trust. How am I supposed to believe anything you tell me ever again? She started crying then. Real tears this time. But they didn't move me the way they would have a day ago. I'd seen too much of her performance to be manipulated by genuine emotion. I love you, she said through the tears. I'm your mother. You can't just throw me away. I'm not throwing you away. I'm setting a boundary. You can't live here anymore, and you can't keep lying to me. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it has to be built on honesty. And therapy, Ryan added. If you're really struggling with loneliness and independence, you need professional help, not elaborate deceptions. Mom looked between us one more time, and I could see her realizing that this wasn't a negotiation. The performance was over, and we weren't going to be manipulated anymore. I'll pack my things, she said quietly. Good, I'll help you load your car. It took us an hour to gather everything she'd brought and all the medical supplies we'd accumulated. The whole time, she kept apologizing and trying to explain, but I couldn't listen to it anymore. Every word felt like another attempt to manipulate the situation. When her car was packed, she stood in our driveway looking lost and older than I'd ever seen her. I really am sorry, she said one last time. I know you are, but sorry doesn't fix what you've done. You need to figure out how to live your own life instead of trying to live mine. She drove away just after 10 o'clock, leaving Ryan and me standing in our suddenly quiet house, trying to process what had just happened. The woman who had raised me, who had taught me about honesty and integrity, had spent 6 weeks lying to my face and manipulating my emotions to get what she wanted. And the worst part was that I still loved her, even though I wasn't sure I'd ever trust her again. The silence in our house that first night after Mom left was deafening. For 6 weeks, our lives had revolved around her presence, her needs, her schedule. Now, Ryan and I sat in our living room, staring at the empty chair where she'd spent so many hours performing her illness. I don't know how to feel, Ryan said finally. Angry, betrayed, relieved, guilty for feeling relieved. I counted off the emotions on my fingers. Take your pick. Do you think she really didn't understand what she was doing to us? I'd been wondering the same thing. Part of me thinks she knew exactly what she was doing, but part of me thinks she was so desperate that she convinced herself it was justified. Does it matter? I don't know, maybe not. We spent the next few days rediscovering what our relationship looked like without a third person constantly demanding attention. It was awkward at first, like we'd forgotten how to be alone together. Our conversations felt stilted, and I caught myself listening for Mom's voice calling from the other room. But slowly, we started to remember who we were as a couple. We had dinner without discussing medication schedules. We watched TV without someone narrating every scene. We went to bed at the same time instead of taking shifts to check on someone else. I missed this, Ryan told me one evening as we sat on our couch, actually talking to each other instead of managing a crisis. I missed you, I said, and meant it. The healing wasn't instant, though. We'd spent 6 weeks in survival mode, and it took time to trust that we could have our own lives back. Ryan had gotten used to working late to avoid the tension at home. I'd gotten used to feeling guilty about everything. Those habits didn't disappear overnight. Mom called 3 days after she left. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to her tearful apology for the third time. She wanted to explain herself, to make me understand why she'd done what she'd done. I deleted the message without calling back. She tried again the next day and the day after that. Finally, I answered. I just want to talk, she said. I want to fix this. There's nothing to fix, Mom. What you did can't be undone. But I'm your mother. We can work through this. We can work through this when you get help. Professional help. I meant what I said about therapy. I don't need therapy. I just need, you need therapy or we don't have a relationship. Those are your options. I hung up and my hands were shaking. Setting that boundary felt like jumping off a cliff, but I knew it was necessary. If she was capable of lying to me for 6 weeks, she was capable of doing it again unless something fundamental changed. She didn't didn't call for 2 weeks after that. When she finally did, her voice was different. I found a therapist, she said quietly. I've had 3 sessions. Good. She says I have abandonment issues stemming from my childhood, and that your father leaving triggered something called learned helplessness. I didn't know what to say to that. Part of me wanted to engage, to understand, to help her process what she was learning, but a bigger part of me was still too hurt to be her emotional support. I'm glad you're getting help, I said carefully. She wants me to write you a letter, not to send, just to process my feelings about what I did. But I was wondering, would you be willing to read it? Not yet, Mom. I'm not ready for that. Okay, I understand. It was a small conversation, but it felt different than the ones we'd had before. There was no manipulation, no guilt tripping, no attempts to make me responsible for managing her emotions. It was just information, shared honestly. That became our pattern over the next few months. Short, careful conversations where she updated me on her therapy progress, and I maintained firm boundaries about what I was and wasn't willing to discuss. She told me she'd joined a support group for people dealing with major life transitions. She'd started volunteering at a local food bank. She was learning to live alone without feeling like she was disappearing. The therapist says I confused being needed with being loved, she told me during one of our calls. I thought if I could make you need me, it would mean you cared about me. I already cared about you, Mom. You didn't need to manipulate me into it. I know that now, but I didn't know it then. Meanwhile, Ryan and I were doing our own work to repair the damage that had been done to our marriage. We started seeing a couples counselor, partly to process what we'd been through, and partly to make sure it never happened again. You both lost yourselves in someone else's crisis, our counselor told us. The question is how to maintain your relationship boundaries when family members are in genuine need. That was the key phrase, genuine need. We'd learned the hard way that not every crisis is real, and not every request for help is legitimate. We talked about how to support family members without sacrificing our own well-being, how to recognize manipulation, and how to set limits that protect our marriage. If something like this happens again, Ryan said during one session, I want us to have a plan. I want to know that we'll check in with each other before making major decisions about other people living in our house. And I want to trust my instincts more, I added. I had doubts about Mom's story from the beginning, but I ignored them because I felt guilty. Guilt can be a useful emotion when you've actually done something wrong, the counselor said, but it becomes destructive when people use it to manipulate you into ignoring your own needs. 6 months after Mom moved out, Ryan and I took the anniversary trip we'd canceled. We went to the same bed and breakfast, stayed in the same room we'd originally booked. It felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from us. Do you think we're stronger now? Ryan asked as we sat on the porch watching the sunset. I think we're smarter. Whether that makes us stronger remains to be seen. I love you, he said, and it felt like the first time he'd said it without reservation in months. I love you too. A year later, Mom and I have what you might call a cautiously optimistic relationship. She's still in therapy, still working on her issues with abandonment and independence. She's learned to ask for help directly, instead of creating crises to get attention. When she's lonely, she calls to say she's lonely instead of manufacturing emergencies. She's never apologized for the money we spent or the stress she caused, but she's acknowledged that what she did was wrong. She's working to rebuild trust slowly, through consistent, honest behavior rather than grand gestures. I may never fully trust her again, I told Ryan recently, and I'm okay with that. You don't have to trust someone completely to love them, he said, but you do have to protect yourself from them if they've shown they're willing to hurt you. That's where we are now. I love my mother, but I don't trust her judgment when it comes to her own needs. I believe she's trying to change, but I'm not willing to risk my marriage or my sanity to find out if her change is permanent. The biggest lesson I learned from all of this is that family relationships aren't exempt from boundaries. Love doesn't mean accepting manipulation or abuse, even from the people who raised you. Sometimes protecting a relationship means protecting yourself from the person you're in a relationship with. Mom still lives alone in the house where Dad left her, but now she's building a life there instead of just surviving in it. She has friends, activities, a routine that doesn't depend on creating crises for other people to solve. And Ryan and I have our life back. We're planning to buy that house we'd been saving for. We're talking about starting a family. We're building the future we want instead of constantly managing the aftermath of someone else's choices. I learned that even the people who love you most can cross lines that shouldn't be crossed when fear and loneliness take control. But I also learned that you can love someone and still refuse to be manipulated by them. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst impulses, even when those impulses are born from pain. My mother isn't a villain. She's a woman who made terrible choices when she felt desperate and alone. But she's also someone who taught me one of the most important lessons of my adult life, that healthy relationships require honest communication, clear boundaries, and the courage to protect what matters most. In the end, my mother taught me one last lesson, that even love needs boundaries, and sometimes protecting yourself is the most loving thing you can do.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop your favorite part in the comments. See you in the next one.